this is really a kind of a different panel we are on now, because here, this is the last panel, and we're looking at a much more of a broader canvas, because this panel is about future direction in peace building. We're also going to focus a little bit on state building and how this fits into the future direction of peace building. But also we want to discuss a little bit about the notion of network governance, which are all in the discussions about peace building and about good global governance, as well as a little bit about what do we know about important peace building projects and trends which are evolving. In order to do this, I think we have a fantastic panel, and I encouraged the panel to provoke and subvert, and to speak, those who have a formal capacity, as Richard has, to speak on a personal capacity. So we have on my left, we have Pieter Feith, a former international civil representative in Kosovo. The fact that he's a former also means that he can speak off the cuff, which again is very good for our discussions here today. Then we have John Fora to my far left, who is Associate Director of Institutional Corporate Social Responsibility in Washington. And because he brings in the private sector, that's the straight talking. So that will also be very good for dynamizing our discussions here. Then, as I said, on its personal capacity and off the cuff as well, Richard Ponzio, a senior advisor in the Office of the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan in the United States State Department. Thank you all for agreeing to speak here. And as I said, let's focus on the future directions, and let's explore what we can put on this canvas, which we want to build up in order to identify what we can do better. Peter, I give the floor to you to start us off.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I don't think that Dutchmen really need any encouragement to provoke, but straight talking is part of our national culture, and we are blunt at times. But what I had in mind really is to speak also very much as a practitioner. We've heard the views predominantly from experts, academicians, and of course a number of players in the senior levels of international organizations. But I myself worked with regional organizations, and I hasten to add in support of the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, although not always with an express authorization of the Security Council. I will come back to that. I first wanted to, if you will permit me, congratulate Abby for the Hague approach, the 6 principles. I would like to call them Abby's 6 commands, which I hope every future practitioner, successor or colleague of mine will have close at hand. Will that make much difference? I sometimes wonder. Will reading the principles make us progress in reaching greater levels of effectiveness as an international community and have greater impact in our actions? I don't want to sound a sour note, but the reality, ladies and gentlemen, is often that in the field, personalities count. Corporate idiosyncrasies play a role. And in the din of war, you see that it is extremely difficult to make people remain mindful of the 6 commands that Abby has laid down. But it so happens that in a couple of weeks I will be mentoring a course for senior mission leaders of the European Union, that is the admirals, generals, ambassadors and heads of mission of the European Union who are going to be deployed for the common security and defense policy operations and missions in the coming period. And I will make sure that Abby's 6 commands will be on their desk right from the beginning, at the beginning of the course. If I may, one pedantic little note. I noted that the first principle has to do with preventive diplomacy. And I had wished very much that the words, Abby, early engagement would have been part of the policy recommendations, because we haven't seen much successful examples of preventive diplomacy, but I pride myself that I was part of one success, and that was to avert civil war in Macedonia in 2001. And why was it successful? It was simply because we were so early in the building conflict that we could squelch any further attempts to create further damage, to create further casualties, and to put at risk the very survival of Macedonia as a state. And early engagement is something that is important, but it depends on political will. And somebody, I think the gentleman there, asked at an earlier panel discussion about political will. Of course, this is not something we can discuss here because it is the unknown, or as Rumsfeld would say, the known unknown in the whole discussion. But if there is no political will, the tendency to resort to early engagement will also decline. And that's a pity. My second point is that we, and I have been working with the UN, with the EU and with NATO, we have been looking and continue to look at the United Nations as the very center, the very heart of peace-building efforts. I see it as the apex of the pyramid, which includes regional organizations, civil society, member states, donor countries acting individually. And when I'm talking about the United Nations, I would like to identify three core tasks of the UN that are particularly relevant for the work of the regional organizations. I'm not going to repeat a mission statement for the UN, so there are other things as well. But I think what is particularly relevant is that the UN is the central provider of legitimacy. That's number one. And secondly, it's the central provider, it is a provider of operational capacity. And number three is that it is, of course, the repository of lessons learned and best practices. Number one is legitimacy. Why do I put this at in the first rank of my 3 points? It is perhaps because of my personal frustration of having worked in Kosovo as an international civilian representative against the background of controversy about the legitimacy of our actions, which was difficult, made our work very difficult, and it was not really taken away by the very helpful opinion of the International Court in 2010, where the judges concluded that the Declaration of Independence of Kosovo was not in violation of international law. But to have legitimacy is important. And if you are going to be deployed into a field by an organization that is split and is in disagreement about the legal basis, then your period of mission is going to be very complicated. But legitimacy, of course, is very important for us all, because it is the only way to convince our parliaments to make available the contributions that the UN and the regional organizations need to effectively perform their missions. The UN is also providing, in an increasingly professional way, a whole range of operational capacities and corporate knowledge. And I think that over the past 15 years, and I remember the times when we were working from NATO, from Brussels, in support of the UN in Bosnia, that the Department of Peacekeeping Operations has significantly improved and strengthened its capacity to run a range of missions and operations at the same time. It's really admirable. There was a time at the beginning of the millennium where we were hoping that the UN would also be the central element for early warning. That is, that in New York we would have regular consultations, we as regional organizations, with the United Nations about intelligence and information that would give us an early warning signal about potential conflict areas in the world, and so that we could prioritize our scarce resources and capabilities and find even possible divisions of labor and organize our work in a coherent manner. Not surprisingly, this didn't work and it fizzled out, but I hope that at some point this will come back. Now let me turn to the regional organizations very briefly. I know that I only have a few minutes left. Regional organizations, not to be confounded with regional arrangements under Chapter 8. And this is not, again, an attempt to be pedantic, but the point here is that certainly NATO, under US leadership, considers that it would be desirable to have a Security Council mandate for enforcement, but that there are exceptions. And I'm thinking back of 1999 when in extremis and for humanitarian moral reasons, NATO proceeded with an enforcement action against Milosevic. It was a limited action, not directed against the Serbian people, but against its leader, its dictator. And when you read Kofi Annan's book, Interventions, you will note that he regrets that there was no possibility for the Security Council to come together on this point and to give directions, but that he understood the justification for the North Atlantic Alliance to proceed without a Security Council mandate. I'm mentioning this, dear friends, because we are close to the point where this may happen again, and I would like to say that my personal opinion is that this exceptional recourse to the use of force in a limited, proportionate manner without Security Council authorization should be possible in view of the egregious, heinous violations of the most important norms of international law that we cherish, and that is the responsibility to protect and the absolute ban on the use of chemical weapons. Now, my last point, which organizations are we talking about? Well, I would mention 4 of them: NATO, the European Union, the African Union, and ASEAN. And one of the happy experiences I have from the last 15 years of work with these organizations was that the European Union was trying to assist the African Union and ASEAN and to work in tandem with them so that there would be regional ownership and that there would be capacity building that we could transfer from Brussels to Addis and to Southeast Asia. In other words, regional organizations helping regional organizations. I thought that was very important. And all these organizations work to relieve the UN of the enormous burden to keep order in the world. There are 3 questions that I was asked to provide an answer to, and I'll do this very briefly. What are the strengths and weaknesses? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to go into a detailed analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of all these organizations. That would bring us far into the night. Let me say this. All these organizations are excellent. All have very clear mandates. All have very professional staffs. But their strength and their weakness depends on the capabilities that the member states are willing to provide them. To take the example of the European Union, there was a period at the beginning of 2000 where there was a lot of momentum, enthusiasm to give the European Union the civilian and the military capabilities to perform peacekeeping and peacemaking duties. That is, both military units were made available, and of course the judges, prosecutors, policemen, civil administration officials that are needed for state building and for strengthening the rule of law in particular. And this momentum has sadly weakened over the past years. Member states are certainly under the influence of the financial crisis are less generous now in providing capabilities. And this is important, and this is sad development because it means that we cannot act as efficiently as we would have liked. I'm not going to dwell too much on the European Union and on the Balkans, simply because the Balkans was an episode, and is an episode that is sui generis. Why? Because peacemaking is very much, and this is a practitioner's point of view, I'm sorry for saying this, is very much also based on leveraging so that you get the results that you want, both in state building, peace building, and ultimately towards reconciliation. And there was no better, and there is no better leverage in the Balkans than the European perspective. The perspective ultimately to become a member of the European Union. If that perspective had not been in place over the past 20 years, the Balkans would still probably be at war. Ethnic violence would still continue. But thanks to the perspective of going through a program of reforms and ultimately being rewarded by membership has helped enormously. So the strength depends on capabilities, and the best organizations, I believe, are the ones that provide both civilian and military, civ-mil capabilities. That is the UN itself and the European Union. My second point is about network governance. I would like to give you a few examples, but let's do that in the question and answer period. I'm going to jump, because we are running out of time, I'm going to jump to the last question, that is the major initiatives in the future, looking ahead. Now, let me give you my three preferred areas on which we should work in the coming short and medium term. First, I believe that reconciliation in Afghanistan is a matter of priority. We have heard about the efforts in Afghanistan, but we haven't spoken about the end game. And I think, in my view, the end game should have been addressed much earlier. It is not a matter only of finding the exit strategy, or as Kissinger said, much exit but little strategy. It is also a matter of providing the best conditions for Afghanistan's future and its people, and that can only be based on reconciliation. And I think that much more effort should be put into this with the help of the United Nations and the regional organizations that are involved. My second priority would be to address seriously the Arab-Israeli conflict. Had we seen an end to the conflict in 1973, when Kissinger was negotiating the second withdrawal from the Golan Heights, and had that succeeded, can you imagine how much less violence there would have been in the region, and how perhaps even less terrorism there would have been in the world now? My third preference is something that is not related to a regional conflict, but it's of a thematic nature, and it has to do with water. I noted, Abby, that we discussed this, that the Institute gives priority in its work to water as a potential source of conflict in the future, because the lack of fresh drinking water for human consumption and for economic development is clearly, and certainly in the Middle East and in North Africa, a factor that will lead to potential conflicts. And I think it would be important if more research and more work can be done on how we can address this problem. Maybe that Abby or one of his colleagues can explain a little bit how the Institute thinks it can address this particular issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Peter, for this for the very clear points. And let me just perhaps put 2 or 3 on this canvas, which I mentioned before, because we are looking here to develop a canvas of ideas for the future direction of peace building. So I think one thing that comes clearly out of your points is the key role for the United Nations in terms of being a central provider of legitimacy, operational capacity, and a repository of lessons learned and best practice. You also highlight the important role of regional organizations and the absolute importance of commitments of member state organizations to make them work and to make them function. And you emphasize the role of vision building. Because, I mean, for many of you who have lived in conflict or violence-affected places, it's often the lack of vision that really hinders people to move forward. And there, as outsiders, I think we really can make a contribution to help building that vision, but to make that a responsible vision that can be achieved. And then finally, you point to Afghanistan, the Arab-Israeli conflict as 2 regional, very important priority areas, and the issue of water, I think. And it's, in fact, the issue of water that leads us straight into the next presentation with regards to the private sector. Because, of course, the issue of water control and the management of water for private enterprises is a critical issue. Perhaps not many people know that many oil companies are, in fact, also the world's biggest water companies, because you need so much water for oil production. Fracking has now been another very important production system, and it uses, I don't know how many million liters of water for every fracking. So here we have a link to the private sector. There are, of course, many other links and roles for the private sector in peace-building situations and peace-building contexts. But John is going to tell us all about that.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've enjoyed the day and learned a lot, and I'm glad to have a chance to say a little bit about business and peace. It's come up occasionally in some of the discussions, but wanted to give a few observations of maybe where some of the thinking is about business and peace. Of course, it'll have a little bit of an academic tinge to it, but also maybe some thoughts about areas where we might look at, understand better these connections between business and peace and how that can lead to better insights and understanding about peace building. So I would say overall we might hope or guess that business and peace is trending. At least as a field of study, it's really only been about 10 or 12 years that even the topic's been researched in any way or looked at. That's not very long, of course. But now it seems to be growing in popularity. It's very gratifying to see that it's part of the approach. I would call that an inspired choice, right, to make. It was maybe, again, looking back 10, 15 years where the issues of sustainability, at least in business, were a bit on the fringe. Of course, people talked about it, but now it's central, right, dead in the bullseye. Maybe looking 10 years down the road, maybe business and peace will have gravitated to the bullseye as well. But it certainly is a topic that has tremendous potential and of interest, but also one that, because of its early days, perhaps we don't know as much about it as we would like to. Also just wanted to say that I assume that for most people here, at least the idea of business and peace is worth considering. But, there are people who might be in a different meeting and they really have a hard time imagining using those 2 words in the same sentence, right? It's just not their training or their experience or their education to think of business as somehow. They have plenty of examples of how business leads to conflict. It's their first thought, but not so much with peace. So it's not always the easiest discussion to have. And in addition, when it comes to talking to corporations about peace. I think corporations, or at least I shouldn't say corporations, the people who work in the positions of vice presidents for government relations or sustainability, corporate responsibility, they've kind of got issue fatigue, right? They're supposed to take on all the issues related to corporate social responsibility, which includes water and the like. And then they have to deal with human rights and incorporate that. And they have to deal with sustainability. And if you come along and say, oh, I've got another one for you, let's just add peace into the portfolio, it's like enough already. So I do think it's a practical matter that if we want to better understand and incorporate the role of business in our peace building, we need to find a way to relate those actions to businesses in a way that they can actually embrace them and see it as an opportunity, not as a burden and just one more thing to do. Because then, of course, it will just be on the fringe of the organization. They might attend the meetings, they might say the right things, they might follow the reports, but it won't have any home in the core of an organization, and that's, of course, the way to get support. That the business sees it's in their own interest and opportunities for them to embrace some of the ideas built around advancing business and peace. So, one of the things that look back on was we did a task force with the U.S. Institute of Peace and our own institute, and that's up on the website, and worked with Raymond Gilpin on that. That was a pleasure to do. But I thought I'd just mention a few highlights, or what came to me as a few kind of central points coming out of that work. One of them is that business should be at the table across the whole range of issues when it comes to development or peace building, post-conflict issues. And most of the time they're not. And of course there's an issue if they're literally at the table, maybe we start to have some conflict of interest, right? We're used to having business come in and be the contractors in reconstruction, or talking to them about investment or how we can encourage them to invest. But our task force came to the view that right from the very beginning, business should be at the table, and if not literally, at least figuratively, that the people who are thinking about the problems that they're confronting, the challenges and what they want to do about them, should be thinking about what might be the role of business as we're trying to solve these problems. What role might they play? I think it's fair to say in some situations the answer might be small, perhaps minimal. It doesn't always have to be a big role, but I just don't think we look enough and think enough about the role of business in the different activities, particularly in a post-conflict environment where they're an asset and a resource and could actively contribute, but it's not always clear how they might contribute. So that's one of them. The other one is really something I guess for shorthand, called peace incidentally, which really means that most of the times when I hear the discussions of business and peace, we start with something that is wrong, something that we'd like to change, and if you're telling me that business is going to be involved in peace, well, okay, why don't they get involved and help solve it? I was at a meeting and we were talking about business and peace, and a woman stood up and said, you know, there are some political prisoners being held in Iran, she mentioned, and I know that General Motors has very good contacts with those people there. Why doesn't General Motors call them up and put pressure on the Iranian government in order to release them if they're so concerned about business and peace? And I would say that's not the kind of formulation we've been talking about. That may have its role, but what we're talking about a lot with business and peace is trying to recognize what is the impact of business doing their activities day in, day out having on the communities where they live, and how might that have some impact on peace. And understanding that role seems a very important part of understanding how to do peace building, and we just don't look at it very much. It could be as simple as, what's their procurement policy? Are they buying locally or are they not buying locally? If they're buying locally, who are they buying from? And how is that company viewed and seen within the community, which the company may not know about, but the local people know about? Or if they want to expand the business, and then they're hiring a certain group, maybe some engineers, but do those engineers all come from, again, a certain community or from a certain group? And so now the people in the community, I mean, it's hard for business often to know what impact they're having. So when we say kind of peace, it's a part of almost believing that business is affecting peace, whether they want to or not. So our view is trying to understand it better, and then we can make better, more informed decisions about how they could do that. A third observation is really to just say what should be the obvious, but that, you know, businesses are in some ways all different. So if we mention something about business and peace and someone says, well, what about the mining companies? The terrible things they may be doing in some situations. Of course, there are many, many businesses that do terrible things out in the community and don't act as good citizens. I mean, everyone understands that. So what we're trying to do is look at which kinds of companies, large and small, international and domestic, those with different kind of cultures, and not try to generalize about business as just some entity which only cares about profit and then anticipate how they'll behave based on that. It's understanding that business can be in many different forms, shapes, sizes, motivations, behaviors, and it's trying to understand that in the context of, say here, in the peace-building context, so then to try to understand what kind of role they may play. We too often just mush them all together and want to talk about business as one homogeneous group, which of course we know they're not. And the last interesting thing I thought that came out was really this kind of connection between stabilization and between business development, which goes both ways. If you're doing a peacekeeping or even a military stabilization operation, if there was business activity in that community, or you could introduce business activity in the community, that would make the stabilization process probably easier, more likely to be successful. And of course, the opposite way. In order for businesses to be successful, for commerce to go on, the environment in which they work, the markets need to be stable. So there may be this compatibility and shared interest between military effort stabilization or peacekeeping and business, which really quite hasn't been explored enough. I mean, I think we know probably intuitively some ways, but in operation, I'm not sure that we could say that the people in the U.S. at DOD who are doing their operations really know very well how to stimulate business, how they can introduce into their operations, what needs to be done. We tend to hear more horror stories about millions of dollars that were spent or wasted in some effort to do some economic development project, rather than, having instructions, guidelines, operational manuals for people to say, how might I do this? How does this work? How do we do it right? So, for having said all that, though, I think we're in a transition period, is what I would argue. We're pretty good at business at peace at the 30,000-foot level. And I think most people, at least who have kind of looked into it or read about it, believe it's a credible case that business can have a positive effect on peace, and that businesses do, in many of their operations, have some effect on peace. It's a matter of what and how. But we're not so good when we try to come down to the ground, just like for a few examples. We typically say that what business should do is follow the law in post-conflict to try to help build. But we know that post-conflict, that the economy looks very much in some areas like a conflict economy. So now that means black market. That means maybe continuing to bribe people or to have private, security on certain roads. So what's that business to do? We at 30,000 feet, we know you're supposed to adhere to the law, but on the ground, when it's not like that, what are you supposed to do? Or if you say create jobs, that's a good role for business to play. But in the same way, depends on who you're hiring, who benefits from those jobs, how is it done. So I think some of the generalizations that we make sound good in general, but they're really not all that strong in practice. So down to a couple minutes here, I can pick a few things. So I thought I might suggest just a few things of areas that we might look at, business and peace connections, maybe looking at them from a different direction. I think one area, at least that we're looking at the Institute, is for peaceful supply chains. As we use our supply chains, trade, commodities around the world, what is the impact that those supply chains and their operations are having on communities, and how does that impact link to peace? We know about greening supply chains, right? We know about governing supply chains. We know about making operation efficiencies, but do we really know how those decisions affect peace? And might we moderate them in that way? Or related, what about looking into being able to say we have a peaceful product? So when someone goes to the store and buys a chocolate bar, they could believe that they weren't using their money to go to something that was causing conflict, that you could assure and authenticate that the way it was made, the way it's done in the community would generally be accepted in those local communities as being part of some peaceful process. We don't really know anything about it, but it would be great if we could, and it could be very helpful to start to identify what those relationships are and bring in commerce. And the last thing I wanted to raise was looking at the role we talked about a bit today was business and R2P. Again, it seems like there's a lot of opportunities in the same spirit of businesses affecting local communities. What can it do for prevention? There are some stories out there. People write about roles that businesses have played in R2P in positive. Sometimes they write about them as they're negative. But in trying to address such an overwhelming issue, it seems, again, that at least business should be brought at the table and thought of what roles might they play, and even what standard and principles might we have for businesses as regards R2P. So one last example, and then I'll be quiet. So even just in telecommunications or in global networks, right, those are many times owned and operated by private companies. Twitter is, right? Social media is, a lot of the internet. There's some state-owned enterprises. What are the standards that those businesses should be held to if certain information, say hate kind of information, or information that's going to stir up conflict, are they free to just pass that information along, or might we have standards? We certainly do it in areas of terrorism. We have standards for them. In terms of drug trafficking, we have standards for them. Maybe there are some standards to be done as relates to R2P. I think these are just three areas where it doesn't come directly at peace building, but it starts to help us understand better what that business and peace connection is. So I'm sure my time is up, so with that, I'll stop.
Excellent, John. Thank you very much. Let me again just pinpoint to three things that I want to throw on that canvas. You pinpoint how important it is to have business at the negotiation table or at the table or surrounding in the environment of the table as we move forward to in peace building situations. I just want to note on that in fact the peace building or the peace process design in Colombia has a fixed spot for the business community at the Havana negotiations. And that is, so what he's talking about is not something which is kind of weird. It's really happening. That businesses do take a much bigger role and a much bigger interest in peace process negotiations because they know if they do not engage early on in the game, they're going to pay afterwards. So, and if you have multiple $1 billion investments in places, you kind of have an inbuilt interest to kind of not shape the agenda, but be part of it, at least. So that's the first thing I throw on the canvas. Then the other thing I throw on there is this day-to-day business and how, in fact, you can shape the behavior of companies that are operating in complex environments in order to make the least possible harm. I mean, the new no-harm agenda in development organizations is like part of the DNA already, at least formally. So in the business world, this is not where companies are yet. Some individuals in companies, yes. But that is something certainly for the future directions of peace building where a lot of effort can be devoted to. I should note that I speak about this in this way because the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform is involved in an 18-month multi-stakeholder dialogue on conflict prevention in the context of large-scale business investments, partly because of the reason that many big companies and peace builders are pretty much convinced that in the next 5 years there's going to be a lot of conflict around large-scale business investments. And the individuals that are responsible on security issues in companies are in fact also worried that the companies themselves are not going to realize this and that action is needed now. So we've been putting together a group of about 100 people in order to discuss this a little bit more systematically, and there are some publications out which I gladly send to those who are interested. Sorry for that brief stint on the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform. Now, I'm going to one thing I want to put on the canvas where I also want to make the link. Yeah, now he gives me the 2 to 3 minutes also.
I was just shifting papers.
That's okay. Now, the multiplicity of actors in peace-building contexts. I mean, we have the business community. You mentioned that the business community is so diverse. I think if we look at future directions, there is a real need to better deal with complexity of actors. Not just the multiplicity, but also the kind of the actors which are structured within them. Some of these big companies, they are as difficult as government administrations, one may say, and sometimes a lot bigger than government administrations. And I think dealing with that complexity, there is still a lot more we can do in the peace-building world. Now, a lot to do with this, in fact, has then to how these complexity, of course, manifests itself in many peace-building operations. And here I think we can really see the evolution of a certain hybridity of governance arrangements, of non-permanent arrangements to get things done. And I think that may be something which Richard may elaborate a little bit on in his discussion on the future of the global peace-building architecture. So, Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Achim, and I'd like to thank Abby and the organizers from the Hague Institute for this opportunity. In today's presentation, this concluding session on the future of peace building, I intend to share some reflections based on my own experience working on international peace building, and in particular in the early years of the Peacebuilding Commission, and I was a member of the team at the Peacebuilding Support Office, as well as share some recommendations as what is commonly called, at least in UN circles, the global peacebuilding architecture. At the center of this architecture are three critical innovations that came out of the 2005 UN Summit. They are the Peacebuilding Commission, PBC, Peacebuilding Support Office, and the Peacebuilding Fund. But given their central importance to sustainable peace building, I will add in my short remarks this afternoon civilian capabilities as a critical fourth pillar of the global peace building architecture, which we've covered today to encompass a number of things: the human, technical, and financial resources in diverse fields ranging from SSR and DDR to economic recovery and building political and judicial institutions, to name a few examples. After sharing some thoughts on the changing nature of the international community's approach to employing and seeking to professionalize civilian capabilities in conflict situations, especially drawing on large-scale missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, where much of my work has been focused the last decade, I'll turn specifically to the UN, giving attention to possible reforms within the PBC. Along with my two fellow panelists, Peter and John, though, I'll underscore the importance of partnerships, including between the UN and those entities in the global north and south who are supplying civilian capabilities to peacebuilding today. It's significant that today's conference has given attention to lessons from the international community's engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq, because whether for better or for worse, the UN and an entire generation of civilians engaged in conflict management and development in conflict-affected countries have been shaped by the scale, scope, and the attempted reach and ambitions of these two major operations. When I arrived in Washington in the spring of 2009, after a decade with the UN, I was immediately struck by the different lexicon employed by my new colleagues to describe and analyze issues which I had become quite comfortable with over the previous 2 decades, and which I had thought there was more or less an international consensus that had emerged. It wasn't the new military-related terminology such as doctrine, interoperability, effects-based planning, and operations employed by my civilian colleagues that surprised me, but rather it was the new areas of emphasis and approaches adopted in connection with the still widely prevalent stabilization and counterinsurgency, or COIN, doctrines that took some time for me to fully comprehend. In short, and contrary to the practice and scholarly work on peacebuilding to which I had become accustomed, stabilization and COIN tended to stress, first, civilians working alongside a well-resourced military component, and unlike recent trends towards integrated missions in the UN system with civilians better coordinated with peacekeepers, stabilization and especially COIN operations are more associated with a comprehensive, large-scale military operation where, frankly speaking, the military security objectives normally trump the diplomatic and development objectives of the civilians. A second key characteristic of the past decade's stabilization and COIN operations is the lead nation role assumed by major Western donor countries in supporting key aspects of reconstruction. We heard many references today to the rule of law work and security sector reform as key examples. Finally, as demonstrated in both Afghanistan and Iraq, the military expended billions in development assistance, broadly speaking, even beyond security institutions, but its goal was narrowly defined in terms of bringing short-term stability to an area rather than building sustainable local capacities. Beyond the United States, another 16 or so Western donor countries which further developed civilian capabilities over the past decade, including here in the Netherlands, were influenced by the major wars of the past decade. But even in Washington, it is remarkable among both practitioners and scholars alike the speed by which fewer and fewer references are made to both the terms stabilization and coin today, the causes of which we can return to in our discussion. What I would like to argue now, though, is that in the midst of this period of change, and for many committed to building durable peace in countries transitioning from war, this is an intellectual vacuum that we're observing that has yet to be filled. And in connection with this concluding section focus on the future of peacebuilding, I firmly believe that the conditions are right for a recommitment globally and in major donor country capitals to core principles and innovative approaches to peacebuilding today, many of which I've learned are key components of the Hague approach, or, as was widely noted a minute ago, Abbey's 6 commandments. Specifically, and contrary to many of the core characteristics of stabilization and coin doctrine, peacebuilding must continue to underscore, first, fundamentally civilian-led efforts to build host nation institutional and human capacities for managing and addressing the sources of violent conflict. Second, a commitment to UN-led multilateral approaches to building local and sustainable capacities for peace, both in the short but as well as over the longer term. Finally, the need to actively source talent from beyond Western donor countries, especially since diasporas and experts from the global South can often bring scarce language skills and cultural sensitivity in addition to technical expertise so needed in peacebuilding missions today. In my concluding remarks, I'm going to return to a few specific proposals for further realizing these peacebuilding principles, and they draw on the Secretary General's reports in recent years on civilian capacities and peacebuilding in the immediate aftermath of conflict. But first, I'd like to say a few quick words about the future of the PBC, which in my view provides the overarching vision, greater coherence, and what one panelist mentioned, the apex or strategic level leadership so critical within the peacebuilding community. In my personal view, the PBC continues to exert needed leadership and serves as a catalyst, and in a sense, the glue for the wider peacebuilding community. But 3 critical reforms are still needed. First, expanding the Commission's reach by returning to the original expectation back in 2005, when the Peacebuilding Commission was created, of inviting each year some 4 to 5 conflict-affected countries to benefit from the work of the PBC. At the time of the PBC's creation, it was widely felt that there were acute needs among multitude of countries recovering from conflict, and that it could take up at least 4 to 5 new countries a year in addition to monitoring countries that had come on in previous years. And while it's understandable that in the early years, 2006 to 2008, the PBC focused on the 2 initial countries of Sierra Leone and Burundi, today there are 6 countries on the PBC's agenda. But as Ms. Judy Chang Hopkins herself noted today, there are at least 20 to 30 countries that are fragile and could benefit from additional attention from New York and the Peacebuilding Commission. Taking on additional countries would require the PBC, though, to target its overall attention to strategic aims and developments rather than concerning itself with specific programmatic priorities and activities. These were lessons, I think, that were effectively learned from the early days. Now, for those who might be skeptical about taking on more countries, it would be too unwieldy. It's important to note that other innovations around the same time as the PBC, the UN Human Rights Council, managed to design a mechanism that reviews the human rights records of some 45 member states annually. And for those who might say it has to get the job done right before it can take on new countries, I strongly believe that the experience of peacebuilding shows us you'll need at least 5 to 10 years, more likely, before you can truly assess whether consolidation of peace has occurred. If you go any shorter in your time frame, the country should never have come before the PBC in the first place. We discussed this morning the importance of conflict tools, and a second reform I'd like to note is how the PBC employs benchmarking, which in the context of measuring peacebuilding refers to pre-established standards of achievement. Progress towards meeting specific benchmarks contributes to the overall peace consolidation goal of a host country. But for benchmarks to aid a peacebuilding commission country engagement, they must be concrete, measurable, and time-bound. For example, and this is an example from outside the PBC, the Afghanistan Compact from 2006 to 2010 included an impressive 52 time-bound benchmarks agreed to between the government of Afghanistan and the international community. Yet some benchmark timeframes were unrealistic and other lacked specificity and were therefore difficult to measure. During my time with the PBSO, we captured lessons from from Afghanistan and other countries in what was called the UN Practitioner's Guide to Benchmarking. And it's good to see PBSO is now building on this effort on developing indicators and benchmarks in connection with the New Deal framework for engagement in fragile states. And these tools and others that have been developed are critical for now this critical question of when a country should be graduated off of the PBC agenda. A third and final critical reform involves redoubling efforts through the PBC to marshal, align, and sustain donor resources in support of integrated peacebuilding strategies. A primary incentive for why a host country welcomes continued international scrutiny and open deliberation on often sensitive issues is the expectation that a mutually binding agreement with international actors will help to mobilize new or at least maintain current levels of foreign aid. Indeed, this is a chief reason the PBC was established in 2005. In the present era of financial austerity in most of the traditional donor countries, it's important, though, that the PBC and the UN system, more broadly speaking, serve as a bridge between a host country and non-traditional donors, beginning with the BRICS, but also natural resource-rich countries in the Arab world and elsewhere. And as John and Peter have both spoken to, regional organizations and the private sector are other key stakeholders that have tremendous resources, financial and technical and otherwise, to bring to bear. A final note in this regard I would propose is the organization through the PBC of periodic review meetings to map donor spending in relation to integrated peacebuilding strategy commitments and to underscore gaps in high-risk sectors. Here, the Peacebuilding Fund is well positioned to play a catalytic role in attracting other donor resources to time-sensitive make-or-break issues in key sectors. As we've heard from many of our speakers today, despite serving as the world's foremost peacebuilding organization, the UN cannot operate effectively without a whole range of different kinds of partnerships. So I'd like to conclude my remarks with 3 concrete proposals related to the sourcing of and networking. We've talked about networking governance today with civilian capabilities for peacebuilding from around the globe. And this is an area, of course, where I feel the PBC and PBSO can continue to provide leadership. First, investing in robust civilian capabilities for crisis response and recovery, especially in the Global South. It's been only a decade, and many offices from the UK Stabilization Unit, Canada's START Task Force, my former office at the State Department, the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization, the international community has come a long way in nurturing and retaining human talent for peacebuilding. However, despite repeated calls from the G8 and other international fora, as well as important innovations such as the UN's Cap Match initiative, much more can be done to foster civilian capabilities from the Global South, which, as I noted earlier, maintains a talent base and skill set most in demand. Here, the UN Peacebuilding Commission can serve as a champion, and the PBSO can gather lessons from various initiatives to train UN peacekeepers and police units, as well as within UNDP, their capacity-building facilities, and apply these lessons to the sourcing of highly specialized coaches and mentors as civilians to work from neighboring countries to a conflict zone. A second proposal is to build a professional network of governments, research institutions, and civil society and business partners dedicated to both investing in civilian capabilities for peacebuilding, as well as ensuring greater interoperability among peacebuilding organizations. Most of the network's activities could be facilitated through a multimedia online platform, which would include thematic discussions in real time, as well as specialized meetings among technical working groups in areas such as training and simulations, lessons learned, joint programming, and fostering civilian capabilities in the Global South. And this is an area that I hope we can discuss in our discussion period, and an area that I hope colleagues from the Hague Institute might take a particular interest. Finally, particularly as major interventions of the past decade wind down, we must not miss the opportunity to divert potential peace dividends to investments in human security. Whether we're talking about northern industrialized countries with the chance to cut back on their military outlays, to conflict-affected countries themselves now moving to a new phase, albeit often a fragile one, on the path towards sustainable peace and development, we must never lose sight of the fact that a strong safeguard against most types of violent conflict today is building inclusive, well-educated, and well-nourished societies. Much progress has been achieved in refining the tools of conflict prevention and alternative dispute resolution. So with an eye towards the 2005 UN World Summit, it's time we marry these tools and the PBC reforms I outlined earlier with the post-2015 debate underway about the successor to the Millennium Development Goals, the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals. And here, of course, I refer to the New Deal framework of engagement in fragile states as providing a useful starting point. So thank you for this opportunity, and very much look forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. Again, for the canvas, which is becoming ever more colorful here, I just want to highlight the issue of very much the importance of partnerships across different sectors and institutions, which is on the one hand the civilian, but also the military capabilities. But I may add to this also the business angle. And the issue of networking of existing peace-building organizations. And there I may just note that Pieter van Tuyl and I, we just over coffee, we had in fact a conversation, Pieter van Tuyl of GPAC, that it would in fact be pretty easy to network the networks together, where you reach possibly pretty solidly most of the peace-building organizations in North America, Europe, and also in many peace-building situations. So that is, I think, a notion we can continue to talk on. And then the other thing I put on the canvas, which always is on any canvas, is money. You mentioned the issue of the importance of funding and how it is important both to continue funding the peace-building architecture and the peace-building fund. But I would also put it wider than this, is the importance of continue the long-term funding of peace-building engagements. It's not about, a previous speaker mentioned that there is always this money flow in the first 2 years. We need it in the next 15 years. And to find the best way around this is still out there. There's still a solution to be found. Now, we have about half an hour for discussion. And I just want to take perhaps a few minutes among the panel to focus ourselves on the issue of network governance. And I'd just like to make one note. What I think is of critical importance when we think about the issue of network governance is that many of the peace-building contexts, or the violence and conflict effect, the violence and fragile environments where peace-building operations take place, they are really marked by this issue of hybrid political orders. That there are multiple overlapping governance arrangements, institutions, actors, or something, which is certainly far removed from anything we would understand as being a neoliberal state. So I think I will place that discussion on network governance in this context, because let's call it the operations theater, in fact, may require to operationalize a networking approach, because institutions are really very badly equipped to operationalize this operationalize in these contexts. To cite Alex Duval, he mentioned in the context of Afghanistan, the UN is just too bad at patronage politics. They can't operate in these contexts. So the issue is, how do we get peace building done in contexts which are marked by hybrid political orders? So you may have other things to note on these issues, but I just want to put this out here to stimulate the discussion on the issue of how do evolving notions of network governance affect the practice of peace building. So you mentioned in your presentation you had a few notes on network governance. You want to pull this in, or you want to come in? Whoever one wants to go first. Peter?
Very, very briefly, I didn't want to touch too much on this because of the shortage of time, but I was engaged in two complex peace programs. One in Aceh, Indonesia, and this led us to work on disarming and demobilizing the Aceh liberation movement and their reintegration into society. Then we worked, of course, on other planks which had to do with local autonomy. And the issue of reintegration, DDR, was touched upon earlier in one of the other panels. Needs the full involvement of civil society. In Aceh, we mobilized the organizations in civil society in the province, the women, and the ulemas, the religious leaders. Why? Because these were the forces in society that were responsible for education of the men who had taken up the arms, and who were certainly also going to be helpful, we hoped, and it turned out to be true, to be instrumental in successful reintegration in society. So when you talk about DDR, these type of issues must be addressed and must be turned into a positive dynamics so that you can achieve the aim of full reintegration. I wanted to mention this example as one of the issues. The other one is local responsibility and ownership. This was one of my main principles in state building in Kosovo. And again, not only with a view to think about exit and departure, but also to make sure that there would be a new leadership in place who would be competent, qualified, non-corrupt, to assume the levers of responsibility and state governance. And we have learned about this, and I think by now we are becoming much better at this. It's one of the principles on which we are working. Thank you.
Do you want to come in on the issue of network governance?
Well, and I was just going to ask for kind of my own clarification. You meaning multi-sector alliances working collaboratively in projects, right? So, well, since you wanted maybe some plain talking, it's a tremendously promising approach, and there's many successes. But as probably some of you know in your own experiences, there's many reasons why it's one of the least likely models to come together. If someone explained it to you, having so many diverse groups with so many diverse interests, different funding sources, different authorities, we're going to come together and work collaboratively for a shared goal, it'd be like, that's the worst, that seems crazy. So it's more to say that I think you have to go into these arrangements with your eyes wide open and how to overcome those barriers. And sometimes money's not enough to do it. Yeah. And sometimes it's that painful recognition that only through a network can a group accomplish more than they can on their own. And many groups or individuals within those groups are very stubborn, right, to recognize that. So I think some of the experience is that you really need to have a very clear outcome that you're working on, that all the parties can recognize, that are relatively quantifiable, so then you can put that on the table and say we're all going to work together for that. I think the more that they're put together at a more goal level, abstract level, then say if we can figure it out, they just fall apart. Mm-hmm. The competition amongst groups, the competition for funding, all of those kind of rivalries that come into place. But having said that, it's very much worthwhile to try to figure out, to overcome that, to learn the lessons and experiences that are done, because it is the most promising approach to addressing these complex problems.
I'll share two brief comments on network governance, both at the international level as well as local, national peace-building context. At the international level, and because I made a reference to the need for a new international network, there is something called the International Network on Conflict and Fragility. It's bilateral and multilateral aid agencies, but government to government. It did play a very important role in initiating what's been called the International Dialogue on Peacebuilding and State Building. I imagine many people here have contributed to that, and the New Deal framework that I referred to, all linked to aid effectiveness agendas, but in fragile, conflict-affected states. Building on that, though, we need something like the Geneva Peacebuilding platform that my colleague Achim leads, but for the world, that engages a whole range of non-state, civil society, private sector, and various partners with governments and international organizations. So that's something we can explore. But very quickly, at the local context, since you brought it up earlier and we talked about hybrid models of governance, a number of speakers today alluded to the fact that authority exists in many ways informally, and to acknowledge that and understand that from the outset of an intervention, and especially even in conflict prevention approaches, is absolutely critical. And besides well-known examples of the Loya Jirga in Afghanistan helping to legitimate the new institutions that were introduced in 2004 and 5, I noticed in my own career the concept of paramount chiefs and other traditional tribal structures in sub-Saharan Africa. Out in the South Pacific, the role of the Church of Melanesia, the role of religious leaders being brought into informal mechanisms with the state institutions was critical for conflict resolution and peace building in those different national contexts.
Excellent. Well, gladly continue speaking on the role of the Geneva Peacebuilding platform. But also let me say that it's not just about the global level. I think we heard many business people and also peace building professionals say that we in fact need these platforms within specific contexts. Because it's not just that in Geneva the different sectors and institutions don't speak to each other. The refugee folks don't speak to the trade folks, don't speak to the human rights folks, don't speak to business. There are these silos in the capitals. But sometimes also there is a lot of networking needs within the very peace-building context because of existing preconceptions, because of existing external influences, which we've talked about today in the case of Afghanistan and Syria and other places. And so the multiplication or the decentralization of networks that are very clearly locally rooted is both a response to the call of the New Deal and the many development guidance notes that are asking for context-sensitive responses, not the global level things, but very locally adapted responses to peace-building challenges. That are then, of course, perhaps networked internationally through networks such as GPAC or the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform to ensure the learning aspect, which has been also so important in the Hague Principles. So I think there is really something in this. We have also seen the network of the G7 Plus at the governmental level. We have seen a lot of very innovative new networks being set out. And I think there may be something in this to explore, whether we can, in terms of, if we think in big ticket terms, in terms of global governance, whether we are seeing a diversification away from the monopolistic control of global governance by state-centric organizations to something which is more diverse. And just at least this is a trend which the National Intelligence Council is foreseeing in its fantastic work on alternative worlds, which sees for the next 15 years a tremendous global diffusion of power away from the state and towards, call them civil society actors or empowerment of individuals or so forth. So I think that may be a trend that the peace-building community needs to take up on. Perhaps by way of closing, let me perhaps put one thing that for me is always very important. Being a network, I meet many people who want to do peace, and they lead institutions whose business is to do peace. And one thing in terms of future direction that they always ask for is, please expand and protect the space for experimentation. Because if you stand by the rule book, if you follow procedures, you're not going to get there. You need people to experiment. If we wouldn't negotiate with gangs in El Salvador, there would today not be a drop in homicide rates as we have seen them. If you do not talk to people that are listed on terrorist lists, you possibly wouldn't be able to have inroads and information in many parts of the world. So we've got to experiment, but we got to expand and protect that space. Now, what that means in operational terms, that's possibly the next conference. And I would like to thank the organizers for this panel